Hey, it's Mr. Ng going over the Precalculus Quiz number 13, 4.4 to 4.5, March 27, 2019. This is versions M, T, and H. Matching on your graphs. Something you should notice is the graph for sines. Sines will start at 0 and end at 0. And in this case, so I know that the amplitude is 1 because the height or the maximum is 1. My graph finishes in pi, so that means, to give you an idea for b, period for sine is 2 pi over b, so this finishes by pi. The question is, what is the b value? If you just cross multiply and then divide by pi on both sides, you get a b value that is 2 for this problem up here. So if you look for sine, we look for a b value that is 2 and an a value that's 1. This would be choice A. Let's finish all the other signs. So same thing here. You'll notice it has an amplitude of 4. The graph finishes by 2 pi over 3. You don't have to do any cross multiplying. Notice that the numerator is the same. Therefore, b is equal to 3. And that would be choice. This one here, so C, amplitude of 4, sine of value, B of 3. This one over here, you notice that its cosine is cosine because it starts at kind of like 1 and then it finishes up there. And my trick is you just turn them sideways and it looks like a sideways C. These kind of look like sideways S's for sines and cosines. So it finishes by, so A is 3, and then this is cosine, and then on top of that, it finishes by 2 pi, which means it has a regular period, so just 2 pi. So your b value is just going to equal 1. So if I look at all my choices over here, that would be B. And then this one over here, I left this portion out here to show you that, well, if your period is 2 pi over b, my b value is actually 2/3 because this graph finishes by 3 pi. And my amplitude is 2. So only one that has 2 and a b value of 2/3 is choice D, 1 point apiece. Question number 2. Which of the following functions have a period of 2? So I have tangent, cotangent, cosecant, and tangent. So tangents and cotangents all have an equation of the period to be pi over b. The other 4 trig functions, including cosecant, are 2 pi over b. Now this one has x over 2, so there's a 1 right here, so it essentially becomes 1/2. So your b value is to the left of the x. And so I have, if your b value is pi divided by 1/2, pi divided by 1/2. I change the division to multiplication here. I take the reciprocal, and then 2 times pi is 2 pi, so that doesn't meet it because we're looking for 2. Cotangent, same thing. In this problem, I have 2 pi is my b value. So pi divided by b, pi divided by 2 pi, pi divided by 2 pi. So what I'm doing here is I'm just canceling my pi's. I get 1/2. So no, that doesn't match 2. Cosecant of pi, so my b value there is pi. And then some of you guys kind of struggle with that. Remember, pi is just like a number. Think of it as 3.14, and then 3.14 divided by 3.14 is 1. So by canceling there equals 1. So your answer is a 2. So that one does match. Let me finish the last one. Your b value is 2. And pi divided by 2 is just pi over 2. So the only one that has a period of 2, the answer is C. Question number 3. Find the phase shift of the graph of the function y equals sine of x minus pi over 2. So if you, let me write that out more clearly. I always like to write the letters above. So you notice that it has I use my finger here. It has an x. The equation must have a minus sign. So if it's a plus, change it to minus minus. Therefore, my c value is pi over 2. When your c value is positive, it goes towards the right. Okay, and another silly way to help you remember that, I have this silly phrase from another teacher: add to x, go west or left. So if you see a plus sign, you're adding to x, you go left. Well, we don't have a plus sign, we have a minus, so you're doing the opposite. So instead of going left, you're going right. Pi over 2 units to the right would be the correct answer. Question number 4. Which of the following is the graph of secant x? Each tick mark, so, this is the x-axis, y-axis, and each of these tick marks are pi is over 2. So which one is secant? Well, the reciprocal of secant is cosine. So this one here looks like tangent, so that's not it. The snake going the other direction is cotangent, so it's not C. Okay, now I'm choosing between these two graphs. Okay, now if you look at this graph starts at 0 and ends at 0. This is the graph of sine. Why is this one the answer? If you draw the graph of cosine, the bucket, right, and then the erase method is that basically secant is above there on the bumps. So I drew cosine there to kind of give you an idea. This one is cosine. But the graph of secant is actually here in my pen. Have any life left? And the greens. Okay. All right, that side was out of 12 points. There's that side. Zoom out here. Okay, you were asked to graph y equals 3 tangent pi x, and you were just asked to identify the variables. So a is 3, b is pi, and then there is no c value because there is no parentheses, there is no x plus the parentheses inside, and then there is no d value because there is no constant. If you got all those correct, then you got a check above it. That means you got the 1 point for this area. Find the period. Remember, common mistake here was students were finding the period to be 2 pi over b. 2 pi over b is only for the other 4 trig functions: sine, cosecant, cosine, secant. Tangent and cotangent have pi over b. So if our b value is pi, something over itself is equal to 1. Now what do you do with this 1? Well, remember, you have to find another common mistake is you have to have 5 values. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if you take a look here, I put 1 over here, and you're starting at 0 because there's no phase shift. There is no parentheses. It's not being shifted left or right. And then you just need to find the midpoint of this. 0 plus 1, $0 plus $1 is $1, and divided by 2, you get 1/2. You and your friend get each $0.50 of a dollar. If I have $0.50 and you add it to $1, or 2 over 2, and if you add those together, you would get 3 halves, and then if you divide that in half again, so 3 halves divided by half, dividing by half or 2 is the same as multiplying by 1/2, you get 3/4. Remember, you can always make that to equivalent fractions, and then you can kind of see this trick that you're just counting by 1/4. So 0, and then you have 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. Another common mistake I saw up here is that students wrote like pi here. The reason why you don't have pi is because pi was canceled out. So it's just this means on the x-axis you have radians essentially, but there is no pi. Okay, I'm going to show you guys 2 methods to getting the this table here, or just to get a graph. So let me show you the first method. The first method says you use basically PEMDAS, and PEMDAS is essentially going from, as long as your d value is over here, you're going from the right to the left. Okay, so we have the x values which are up here, and then you're going to multiply the x values times pi. So pi times this number is 0. Pi times this becomes pi over 4. Pi times 1/2 is pi over 2. Because remember, pi is in the numerator. Pi times 3/4 is 3 pi over 4, and pi times 1 is pi. The next thing is I'm going to take whatever I just found and find the tangents of those values. So tangent at 0, remember tangent is y over x. So 0 divided by 1 is 0. Tangent at pi over 4, this would be radical 2 over radical 2, which is 1. If you want to, you can also do the whole radical 2 over radical 2. Something over itself is 1. Tangent at pi over 2, this would be y over x. So it will be 1 divided by 0 is undefined. That's the u. Tangent at 3 pi over 4, anything at the 4s, tangent and cotangent are just going to be 1 or negative 1. You have radical 2 over negative radical 2 gives you a negative 1. Remember, you can double check that. All students take calculus, so only sine and cosecant are positive. Everything else is negative, including tangent. Tangent at pi, y divided by x is 0 divided by negative 1. That gives you 0. So the last thing I need to do now is multiply by 3. So I just take this row and multiply by 3. So it's kind of like if you think of this table or this chart here, it's just kind of like mass production to get your values. So 3 times 0 is 0, 3 times 1 is 3, 3 times undefined is still undefined, 3 times negative 1 is negative 3, 3 times 0 is 0. And basically, my order pairs are, these are the x values, and then these are my finished y values. So let's go ahead and graph this. 0, 0. Right there. 1/4, 3. 1/2 undefined, that's my asymptote. 3/4, you have negative 3. And then at 1, you have 0. Remember for tangent and cotangent, I drew this one, you should have like a 3 dots. That's how you know you're doing it correctly. A fancy way is, the reason why is that the slope of tangent is linear. And so yeah, you need to have those 3 dots. Those are your hints. So I just put an open circle there because that's outside of what we did. So this is essentially what we did. This is what your graph's going to look like. Make sure you have arrows on both sides. If you extended the graph, great. All right, let me show you my second method. It goes a little bit faster, but it's different because it's a lot more mental math. You basically take your same 5x values, and then you just do it all mentally. So x value is 0, 0 times pi is 0, tangent at 0 is 0, and 0 times 3 is 0. 1/4. 1/4 times pi is pi over 4, tangent at pi over 4 is 1, 1 times 3 is 3. 1/2. 1/2 times pi is pi over 2 at tangent is undefined, undefined times 3 gives you undefined. 3/4. 3/4 times pi is 3/4 pi. 3/4 pi at tangent is negative 1, and negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. 1 times pi is pi. Tangent at pi is 0. 0 times 3 is 0. And essentially you would graph those same points, and that's how you graph it. So how did I score it? You got 1 point for the table with the checker X there. The shape, did you know that tangent goes left to right is increasing? Accuracy, looking at the graph, and then the x-intercepts, I was actually looking at those values. And then it was at 6 points. Question number 9. Secant, 3 minus secant, 2x plus pi over 2. The first thing you need to do there is you need to have factored out a 2. You have 2 is my GCF. So 2 times x gives me 2x. 2 times pi over 4 gives me pi over 2. Remember, we kind of did this trick in class. There's the box. If you don't know what's going to go inside the box. So 2 times a box equals pi over 2. And remember, to get rid of this 2 here, you're dividing by 2. Dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/2. And you get the box to be pi over 4. That's how I got the pi over 4. Okay. Now, hopefully you recognize that I have my letters here. The d value is this constant. So the a value is right in front of the trig function. So I have a, b, which we just factored out. And then your c value is inside there. And then the d value is way out here. So common mistake, a lot of students thought to subtract these two, 3 minus 6, and they thought that was the a value. That answer is incorrect because the negative 6 is attached to secant. It's kind of like, think about it like this, 3 minus 6x. Would you say that this is negative 3x? The answer is no, they're not like terms. So my a value is negative 6. Now remember, this is just an a value, not the amplitude. And this helps you find other things. B is equal to 2. That's what we just factored out. My c value is a negative pi over 4. And again, the reason why it's a negative pi over 4, if you wrote this, let's see if I can write it in here, you need a minus sign. So remember, that's our c value. And the d value is a vertical shift up 3. So these are just helpful to help get you what you need. Period for secant. Remember, another common mistake, just a basic one, the reciprocal of secant is cosine. So in this first method over here that I'm going to show you guys, we're basically graphing cosine, and then right above it, you just put secant. That's it. So 2 pi over b value is 2, cancel your 2's, then you're with pi. Okay, what does that mean? The graph finishes, if you look at my graph, my finished product, this is a period. And the distance here is pi. Okay, so why do I have to do between 0 and 2 pi? The answer is anytime you have parentheses, you do it between 0 and 2 pi. Look up here at tangent, there is no parentheses, so you don't have a shift, so you don't have to put it between the inequality. If you get stuck on that, you could have just put it between 0 and pi, and then you could still solve it. It's still the same. So I use the inequality here. You can use either of these. 2x plus pi over 2 is what I chose, the original problem. Even if you did the other one, the factored one, you would still get the same thing. A lot of students are struggling here. Remember, you're using PEMDAS. Let me write this out. You use PEMDAS here to simplify. But when you're solving, you go backwards. What does that mean? A lot of students' common mistake here is divide by 2. That would be wrong because you would have to divide the whole expression by 2. This expression by 2 and this expression by 2. That's kind of difficult for students to understand. So you would just add and subtract first. Pi over 2, subtract pi over 2 from both sides. 2 pi is equivalent to 2 pi over 1, which is 4 pi over 2. You subtract 4 minus 1 gives you the 3 pi over 2. And over here you have negative pi over 2, and then we just have 2x. How do you get rid of the 2 here? You divide by 2. Remember, dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/2. And if you multiply by 1/2, you get 3 pi over 4 and negative pi over 4. So the graph's going to start at negative pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4. Those are my values right here. I'm starting on my table. Okay, so I have negative pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4. Negative 1 plus 3 is 2, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. And then 1 plus 3 divided by 2, 1 plus 3 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. Negative 1 plus 1 gives you 0. 0 divided by 2 is 0. And you'll recognize that you're counting by pi over 4. Again, now my table, you can choose either equation to work with, and I'm choosing to work with the original equation. Remember, you just change the secant to cosine. So here, I'm going to multiply all my values here by 2. So this gives me negative 2 pi over 4, 0, 2 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, and 6 pi over 4. And I did something interesting. I chose to, what did I do? That is a 2. I chose to then add pi over 2. So pi over 2 is the same thing as 2 pi over 4. So 2 pi over 4. 2 pi over 4 plus negative 2 pi over 4 gives you 0. 2 pi over 4. 4 pi over 4. 6 pi over 4. And 8 pi over 4. And then what I did is I just reduced them. Pi over 2, 1, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And then here you have the golden row for cosine. And then that would be 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. And then here, you're just going, again, right to left. And you're now going to multiply that by negative 6. And then here, the last one, I know it doesn't say plus 3, but this is addition. plus 3. Because if you move that plus 3 way over here, it would be plus 3. So really what you're doing is you're adding these values, adding 3. And then I'm going to graph these. Okay, so another common mistake is then students try to put this back into secant, and that would be incorrect. Remember, you're graphing cosine and then erasing. So I'm going to graph now these points. So with these points, I'm going to graph these points. So if I graph negative pi over 4, I go down negative 3, pi over 2, not pi over 2, 0, I graph at 3, and pi over 4, I'm going up to 9. At 2 pi over 4 or pi over 2, I'm going up to 3, and then at 3 pi over 4, I'm going to negative 3. And if you recognize what I'm doing here is I'm graphing this in green. This is the inverted verse of cosine. And then this is the erasure mark. This is what you're erasing because you're actually going to graph secant above and below those bumps. Okay. Now how do you know that there are asymptotes? The second way that you can actually look at this problem. So here's a second way of graphing this. Okay. It goes faster, but you're going to have to use your mental math a lot better, is that you're still taking your 5x values, and you're substituting them, and you basically get a y value. So negative pi over 4 will give you negative 2 pi over 4, plus 2 pi over 4 will give you 0. 0 at secant. Secant is r over x, so 1 over 1 is 1. 1 times negative 6 is negative 6, and negative 6 plus 3 gives you negative 3. Why is there an asymptote here at 0? If you substitute it in, you'll realize that it's undefined. So you have 2 times 0 is 0. You get pi plus pi over 2 is pi over 2. Secant at pi over 2 would be r over x. So 1 divided by 0 is undefined. Undefined times negative 6 is still undefined. And if you add 3, you're still undefined. So that's why you have a asymptote. And you do that for the rest of those, and you realize that you get the pink graph. Again, that was worth 6 points. That side was out of 12. 12 plus 12 is 24. I hope these quiz corrections were helpful for your test on Friday. Good luck.